Hello, viewers. My name is Pullenayegem, and I'm the director of the Congregational Vitality Initiative at the Vancouver School of Theology in British Columbia, Canada. Today, I have with me some illustrious people, some authors of two very recent books that talk about congregational health and vitality. The purpose of today's conversation is mainly to explore their findings on what it means to be a thriving or flourishing congregation. These words will vary as we will be interchanged as we go along, and share some of their insights on what this means for churches as we all journey through this very unusual time of our lives together. So I'm going to begin by thanking you folk for your time, and not just your time here, but also your time in doing the research, which can be painful at times. So thank you so much for all the investment you put into this, which really goes to serve the wider church. And I'm going to invite you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll dive into our conversation by asking some questions and see where that takes us. So I'm going to start with Tammy. Tammy, in about 2 to 3 minutes, could you tell us, just introduce yourself and kind of the why for the book that you wrote with Loraine. So we'll start with you, then go to Loraine, and then end up with Joel, if you don't mind.
Okay, great, thanks. So yeah, my name is Tammy Allan. I serve in ministry with the Old Sundry Pastoral Charge in South Central Alberta. And 2 and a bit years ago, I was looking at sabbatical and really wanted to look at congregations that are thriving and take that learning and bring it back home, not just to my own pastoral charge, but to share it in the region in which I live. And so part of it was to do some of that learning, but it was also to re-energize my own ministry. I, at that time, had been in rural ministry here for 6 years, and I had served in urban and kind of resource community ministries as well. But it was just, I was feeling like time to renew and refresh. And actually, Loraine wrote the book, and I kind of contributed the rural perspective. So just that clarification is probably a good thing. But yeah, so that's who I am.
Thank you. Loraine?
Yeah, so in 2019, I went on a sabbatical, very similar to Tammy, trying to find ways in which the church that I serve, which is Westworth United Church in Winnipeg, might do a little better. They're doing great. You can always do better. And so I was running out of ideas and thought, now's the time to read some books on how to help churches thrive, and then decided to visit some of these very churches that are thriving. So I did a cross Canada tour, identified a number of churches with lots of recommendations from people to visit. The good news is that there are way more churches, United churches, because Tammy and I are United Church ministers, so we focused on just United churches. There are way more United churches that are thriving than I had, and well, we had time to visit. So that was good news. So I visited mainly urban churches from coast to coast.
That's a long distance.
I focused on the prairies just for family limitations. I stuck to the prairies.
Okay. Just in case you're a viewer from out of Canada and you don't know the time zones we live in, we are separated by 5.5 time zones. So that's how big our country is, just in case you're wondering. When Loraine says coast to coast, it means 5.5 hours of time zones. Thanks, Loraine. Joel.
Yeah, hello everyone. Sorry, I've had some technical difficulties here, internet instabilities. But anyways, my name is Dr. Joel Thiessen. I am a professor of sociology at Ambrose University. I'm in my 13th year on faculty. And over the last couple of years, I have authored or co-authored different books related to those who say they have no religion in Canada and the United States. Also written a book on millennials in Canada. And then most recently, and for this conversation, a co-authored book on flourishing congregations in Canada. And this draws upon research with Catholic, mainline, and conservative Protestant churches across Canada, interviews with over 100 church leaders from coast to coast, and survey data with over 250 churches and 9,100 participants, mostly congregants within the pews. And so we've written and published and spoken about some of that research, and looking forward to digging into some of that data a little bit today as well.
Great, thank you. So it seems like the books have had different genesis, and you come to it in different ways, and all of them are good ways. So Joel, I'll start with you by asking you a question. So can you give the viewers and all of us a brief synopsis of what your findings were, talking to an audience, like I said, of people who are actually actively practicing congregational life, whether it's a minister or a congregant. Just give us a sketch, and I'll happy to put up the PowerPoint on screen if you like to do that right now.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, there's a lot of things that I could say in terms of some of our core findings, but kind of a brief synopsis that we'll see on the screen before us here is that first and foremost.
Wait, I'll put a slide up.
Yeah, sure. Give you a second there.
But you can keep talking.
Okay. Yeah, first and foremost, there is a strong debate among church leaders, and to a lesser extent among scholars and academics, on whether flourishing equals numeric growth or not. And so in our own research and our conversations with church leaders, we find that there is a strong debate. There are some who will say that you must be growing numerically in order to be flourishing. Others will say, listen, you don't need to be growing numerically in order to flourish, that you can flourish in a variety of ways. One of the second things in our research, and it's captured well in this book, Signs of Life, that's come out, and then within the image at the center of your screen, is that there's a theological variation in how to define a flourishing congregation. So here you see organizational ethos, internal dynamics, and outward characteristics with different dimensions within that. And what's really important within our research is that different denominational and theological heritage very much shapes what groups define as important. For example, some traditions will say evangelism is really important for how they define and think about a flourishing congregation, whereas others will say this isn't actually pertinent or as central to how we see ourselves in a dynamic congregation. Whereas others will say we need to be involved in our neighborhood or discipleship, or we need to be a diverse community, and so forth. And so really we spend time looking at each of these areas and elements. And the final thing I'll say, and again, this is just a very small cursory overview of many things we could explore, is that no church is flourishing in every way. Right? Sometimes we assume that just because a church is growing numerically or because it's a large church, it must be flourishing. And this might be true. They might be flourishing, but they're not flourishing in every way. And at the other end of the continuum, I would say that few churches are without some degree or element of flourishing. If you were to look at these 11 different areas and you look at your own congregation, you might say we're not growing numerically, or we wouldn't say we're flourishing on the whole, but there are some signs of life and vitality. Perhaps we're innovating and experimenting and trying some new things. And this is an area of strength. And one of the key takeaways in our research is that groups can and ought to build off of the strengths that already exist within their church setting. So there's a few opening remarks, and we unpack some of these things further in this book and some of our other articles as well.
Thanks, absolutely. I hope that some of those facets will come out as we speak and kind of dig a little deeper. Thanks, Joel. Loraine, I'm going to come to you now and ask you to give us kind of a quick overview of what you found and any surprises, anything that you knew. Yeah.
So as I was visiting these churches, it became quickly apparent that they shared in common not what they did in ministry, but who they were. So they attended to their context. They all did that well, but their contexts are very different. So what they did was usually different from one another. As I began to look at the commonalities they shared, it struck me that they were very similar to the spiritual attributes of the early church, churches, I should say, as described in the book of Acts and the epistles especially. So that was a bit of an aha to me. And in this book, Thriving Churches, I outline the spiritual attributes that Tammy and I both found in common, with her with rural churches and me with urban churches, and then how they related to the early church, both strengths and weaknesses, actually, because the early church was not a vessel of purity. It had all sorts of conflicts and problems. So those two were shared in common with some of the churches we found. It wasn't without conflict, it was how they dealt with conflict. But that goes more in depth into one of the attributes that I won't go in depth to any of them at this point. The second thing, and that takes us to the second slide, is we found that they were able to focus on relationships. Relationships seem to be more important than anything else. And there's three relationships they focused on. One was with God. So they had developed all kinds of programs to help them develop their spiritual lives, the spiritual gifts, their nurture and spiritual development in their faith, for children, but also as well adults, so for people of all ages. So that was very important. And the second thing was with one another, relationships with one another. So they focused on getting to know one another, developing communities. Small groups were crucial in doing that. Meetings always began with check-in, often with food. They would prioritize fundraisers that would build community as opposed to simply bringing money in. Because again, relationships, not money making, was the most important thing. And then the third area was with the wider community. So all of the churches that I visited had very strong relationships with the wider community, different types of relationships depending on what the communities were, but partnerships with ecumenical and interfaith partnerships were very important. Identifying community needs that were around them and finding innovative and creative ways to meet those community needs. But again, it was relationship based, so it wasn't a unidirectional, missional idea of outreach. It was, how do we develop relationships with those around us? So a mutual way of giving and receiving. And then the next slide takes us to another area that we found, and that was a number of the churches talked about using a discipleship model versus a membership model. So the membership model asks questions that emphasize numbers, like how do we get more bums in the pew? How do we get more money? How do we increase our numerical value, whether that be financial or the people on the membership roll? The discipleship model emphasizes relationships, as just explained in the previous slide. So the questions they would focus on would be, how do we fully live the way of Jesus? What enlivens our spirits and the spirits of others? They would focus on those questions and not worry about the numbers. The numbers can distract and take our priorities in a way that may not be as faithful. Certainly leads to worry when we see decreasing numbers. But if the focus is on discipleship and relationship building, then that is what attracts people. And these churches I visited found that in fact the numbers followed, but don't focus on the numbers or they won't follow. That's a nutshell of what. Yeah, and we won't go into this at this point. This may come up.
And Tammy, would you like to add something? I know that you didn't author the book, but you contributed heavily towards it. So, from a perspective of rural churches, maybe.
Those were really the similarities. And for rural churches, I think I would say we kind of had some top 5. Like I would sort of identify the top 5 of the attributes, and the top 1. From my experience, what I learned for the congregations in the rural communities that were thriving and seemed to be full of life were those that lived their church life and their outside church life from a perspective of mission. and what we can do and what God is calling us to do, not from that perspective of how can we get more people in here. It was how do we look out beyond our buildings and be part of the community. And that was about caring for community. It was about ecumenical mutuality. It was about all kinds of things. But mission was, I came away from that 3 months with that very strong. The stronger ones are the ones that are really mission focused.
Thank you. And it seems from hearing the three of you, in some shape or form, I've heard from all of you that you go down to that classical 3D model of being church, right? The upward, which is with God, relationship with God, the inward, which is with yourself and the immediate family, and then the outward. And I think Joel and Loraine, you have all talked about that in various ways. Joel, I want to ask you, you also approach it from an organizational perspective, right? I mean, you talked about organizational ethos and some of the constructs that you have used. Tell us more about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, one of the things that we sometimes forget within church contexts is that churches are also human organizations. And like any other kind of organization, there's certain structures and mechanisms and processes that help an organization to run well and effectively. And sometimes within church settings, we sometimes lay back and say, well, sort of, God is driving this, and what happens just sort of happens in and through a spiritual context. And that's not to diminish the spiritual activity at work in organizations. But we know that, congregations that have a clear identity of who they are, where they've come from, where they are now, and where they're going, who value leadership development, who are equipping and empowering other leaders and bringing others into an organization's life, who are directing all of their activities around some clear structures and processes that help them to actually embody the very things that they believe they are called to do. So these are the kinds of examples of an organizational ethos that help a congregation to thrive, that are innovative, that try new things, that experiment. That we know this in all kinds of new entrepreneurial startup organizations, to organizations, as we've seen through the pandemic, that need to reinvent themselves. And those who take a very proactive role towards organizational life, it doesn't mean they will inevitably flourish, but it's one of those necessary components that can intersect with some of the things that Loraine and Tammy have also talked about on discipleship and outward focus, that those things don't happen by accident. They require a high degree of intentionality as a church and as an organization. So those are some of the things that we tease out in and through our data and conversation with church leaders and congregants.
Thank you. And by the way, feel free to jump in, anyone else who wants to add or ask a question, because this is a conversation, remember. But it's a good segue to a question I want to ask of all of you, and maybe start with Joel again. And that is that we are all aware that each church or congregation has their own organizational culture. And we know that culture, even though you see it practiced in many forms and, to the eye, below the surface are things that actually drive that culture, right? So there are assumptions, there are beliefs, there's a worldview, there's ways of operating that the operational system you don't see. So in your research, and this question is to actually all of you, in your research on thriving congregations, what do you think some of the assumptions and beliefs are that actually facilitate the practice of being outward oriented or missional, or whatever word you want to call it? But what are some of the things that you see or that you noticed, mostly unsaid, I think, because people don't say these things when you ask them, but is there anything that you observed, some belief or some assumption or a particular kind of worldview about church and the world?
Yeah, there's a couple of things we've definitely seen in our research, and other scholars and studies of national studies with large samples and so forth. One is that theology matters. So the undergirding theology of what a church believes about God and themselves and relationships in the world actually drives what they do in theory. And so this is a really important undergirding value. I think another element is the degree of control that groups believe they have over their own thriving or flourishing. That is, are there things that we can do that can move us toward the things that we're called into? Or do we think that most of what happens to our church is actually a reflection of what is happening out with our control? That is, what's changing in society and culture and those in our neighborhood. And I think congregations that are flourishing seem to have a high internal locus of control. There are things that we can do. And with that, not necessarily that they aspire to grow numerically, but I think there is an element for some that we do want to make a difference missionally and even numerically, and that growth mindset that we're never settled. We always want to improve and find ways to strengthen our ministry in the ways that God has called us to do. So some of the things that we've seen anyways in our research so far.
Did you come across something similar, Loraine, and Tammy, in the questions that you asked and some of the observations you made? Like what was driving that behavior, right? If a church is thriving because they are focused outward, like Tammy was saying, what is driving that? Was it the theology, or was it some kind of leadership in the church that was helping the church to navigate a certain way, or?
I guess theology does matter indeed. And so I think Tammy and I would have seen similar things focusing just on the United Church. But for the United Church, call is really important.
Okay.
And we will talk a lot about call. What is our call to ministry? What is our church called to be? And that suggests that God is equipping a particular church with the particular people who are there, with the gifts they have, to do a certain kind of ministry. And that is the calling that we try to find. We are always, so thriving churches, we're always discerning that, because people change, gifts change, context changes, needs change. It requires continuous discernment and listening to the Spirit in that discernment. And so that, I think, would all come under the category of call to continue to be sensitive to the Spirit's nudgings and how the call that changes according to all of the changes that happen in the church. Tammy?
I would, from the rural perspective, the one thing I would add is a real commitment to the history of a community. And sometimes that can be a hurdle, because there's a sense of, this is our history, this is who we are. But the key is the discernment of, okay, that's who we were, and what are we becoming, and what is God calling us to become in this time? And that, again, is a real factor in thriving congregations, is that they're willing to do that discernment and to recognize that it's not a do it, it's done, we're finished, that it's an ongoing process. So there's honoring the history, but there's also recognizing that life changes, and we need to be about discerning God's call all the time.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it seems like the converse is also true, that if you are stuck in your history in the past, you'll probably never be able to move forward. So may I ask you, did you discover any processes or any, the discernment process? Did you come across churches that have gone through a process, or what they use, or how they approach discernment? Do they go out on the streets and talk to people who come in, or do they pray, or?
We're actually living it right now here in my pastoral church.
Tell us about it.
We're working with one of our regional staff and one of the staff from Edge to do that discernment, and we're looking at broadening the boundaries of our pastoral charge with a memorandum of agreement to work with a third church. And so there's been a whole process of asking, looking at the mission, doing some biblical reflection related to that. it's been an ongoing. We started back in September with monthly meetings with groups from the three churches, and we're being led primarily by a staff person from Edge, Christine Jarrett, whose contract with Edge finished, but she's staying on with us to finish the
And what are some of the
process.
components of the discernment process?
We've been doing a really good component of biblical reflection and talking about how does that apply to us in our time now? How does that what are the key elements of that story that are being played out in our world today? So every step has carried biblical story along with it, which really ties into what we learned about the attributes in the book. And then we're moving into, okay, now that we've kind of discerned who we are and what our values are, how can we come together and work together? So we're just at that point right now, and we'll be moving into the process has sped up because one of the third congregation that is considering joining us, halfway through the process, their minister made the decision to retire. So now there's a little more fire under
I might add one other thing, Chris. With the discernment, one of the commonalities we found is that they seem to, if not by name, follow the intention of appreciative inquiry. So appreciative inquiry means to look at what you have as opposed to what you don't have. It takes us out of mourning the past, mourning what we no longer have, and celebrating what we do have. It is a gift-centered approach. So you look at who's there and what the gifts are they bring. I mentioned that before. But the focus is never on, oh, we used to have 500 children in Sunday school. We used to. That actually doesn't get us anywhere. Instead, we have 12 children in Sunday school. Isn't that amazing? And work with those 12 children and be excited about what you have. Because when newcomers come into a church, they don't want to hear about what's no longer there. They want to hear about what's there right now. So that it's one of those attitude pieces, right? Is who they are. And they are people who tend to look fairly optimistically about what they have and what they're called to be.
So sorry, go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, I would add to that as a social scientist that one of the tools that congregations have and are drawing upon in that appreciative inquiry approach is to meet with different groups or subgroups within their congregation to talk about, what do you value most about our congregation right now? And it doesn't mean you dismiss the things that aren't going well, but you begin to talk about and accentuate what is going well, to dream, where would you like to see us in 1 year from now or 3 years from now? That this kind of discussion can be quite healthy to include different members of a congregation towards working toward those things that they aspire to be. Some congregations are doing some congregational-based surveys to help them in that discernment process, to identify the areas of strength that can be some tangible next steps as well for groups who are very much leaning into that appreciative inquiry approach. And I would say that groups on the other end of that, as part of that discernment, can capture that core identity or mission that they're called into we titled one of our chapters, like, can you say it on the side of a bus? And we heard this from a church leader. Can you clearly and concisely say the thing that you believe God has called you to be and to do for this particular group and time and place? And I think it's one of the markers of those conversations of groups who seem to have a good grasp of, what it is they're called to be and do.
I like that. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to add to that in the appreciative inquiry, one of the other pieces of our process is we've gone out into the community and talked to different community agencies as well, and looked at how is God calling us to serve the wider community, and that's particularly important in the rural regions where those agencies, a lot of them are dependent upon the discipleship of people within our congregations.
I looked at both, your synopsis, and I found the word innovation in both of your presentations. And I think that's a key piece, because hearing all of you, innovation requires that you're willing to look at something new, which means that you looked at the old and it's not working. So you're willing to kind of look at something new in a new way and in a creative way. And I think that goes back to being adaptable, right? I think, Tammy, you were talking about not being anchored in the past, but being willing to change, that whole change. And my sense is that a lot of our church or the congregations are not at the point where they are willing to change from the historical past, from their roots, because somehow or other they have been tethered in the past, and they were flourishing at some point of time, but that whatever they did at that time it's not working anymore, and they don't let go. So here's a practical dilemma, and I want to pose this question to all of you. I think, Loraine, you mentioned about the difference between being a discipleship-oriented church and a membership-oriented church, right? That kind of wording. So we have churches, congregations who are who might have a pastor who might be only able to fund a half-time pastor. They have a building that they need to maintain because either the roof is falling down or something's happening and it's cold, the furnace is gone, busted. And for them to be viable, I'm not talking about being vital, I'm talking about being viable, they need people to contribute, which can translate to mean they need bums in pews, basically, right? They need membership. What would this for all three of you, what would your advice and what would your encouragement be to that kind of congregation who is really stuck on being viable as against the congregation that is to be vital, and flourishing and thriving? What would you say to a person who comes and tells you, I've got this problem, I've got a huge billion on my hands, can maintain, we can only afford half a pastor's salary? What would you say, given your research, given your findings?
I think one of the first questions I would ask is around how married you are to that building. And is it time to repurpose that building or divest yourself of that building and find a way to continue to be a viable community of faith, whether it's renting back space in that building or whether it's finding a space that's more appropriately fit to your mission and your ministry? That'd be question number one.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Anybody else, Joel?
Yeah, I think, being clear about what a congregation's mission is an important starting point, which can help then answer the question of how essential or not a physical building is. But I think you also find that when a congregation and its leaders can provide a compelling vision, that people are willing to get behind that and actually provide dollars and volunteer hours and showing up to different events, etc. And that these two are linked. As much as some groups want to downplay these practical things, they actually are essential for organizations to not just be viable, but to thrive in the short and long term. So these are important things to then build upon the past and to not necessarily, even though there might be things of the past that hold a congregation back, to not view the past as a bad thing. There are important things that lay an important foundation for where we are. So how do we build on the strengths of the past, but then also continue to provide a bit of a cultural exegesis of our surrounding, like our social context is changing. And how and why might we adapt and innovate to these changing circumstances around us so that we can meaningfully live into that core identity and mission? And here you begin to see the interplay between these things. It's not like we can just focus on this or this or this, but actually these all intersect in some fairly pivotal ways, I would say. And this is where you see congregations who can adapt and continue to thrive as society changes around them, as the organization itself changes, as leaders change, et cetera, et cetera.
That's good.
Yeah, and I might add that when congregations are worried about viability, so in other words, when their focus is on survival, then they tend to become inward focused, and that emphasis, that looking at the numbers is almost the death knell. I agree with Joel and Tammy, and I've said it too, about mission focus. To retain their mission focus is absolutely central. So if they are able to set aside the worries about viability, to move out of survival mode, then, if they're willing, then they might be able to retain or find again that excitement about mission. I think the word excitement is key. It's not just, okay, we need to do another, well, we've done so many visioning processes. Okay, here's another one. Okay, now we have a mission statement, ho-hum. If it's a ho-hum, then it's not going to work. So they have to be passionate and excited about it. So how do you tap into their passion? What can help them find that spark of life again? That spark that I believe comes from the Spirit. It also comes from that openness to one another. And it takes us to another word we haven't said yet, and that's risk-taking. That is something that we found, Tammy and I found almost everywhere. Churches were, and many of them had financial challenges. It wasn't as if they were void of financial challenges, but they decided to take, it's called responsible risk-taking. So to be responsible in what you get excited about and what you discern God's call is to be, but to not be afraid to take risks. And some of those risks might be selling the building. Some of those risks might be sharing it with another congregation or another organization, or it might be giving up control over the color of the carpet or the walls if you're going to be sharing that building with someone else, right? It's that risking partnership, risking giving up control. There's a lot of risk taking. If you don't take those risks, you still take risks, and the risk is staying the same and dying.
So two things I picked up. One is mission. To be mission focused, I think you have to be rooted and grounded somewhere. And you mentioned, life from the Spirit. And I think there's a yin and yang kind of relationship with being mission outward focused, but inwardly grounded with God, the Spirit, and with yourself as well. So I think that's something that needs to be worked on, I think. But given the fact that our congregations are mostly older, here's a question about COVID. How do you think, and they're used to Sunday service in a building. That's what they've been used to. How do you think COVID has actually gifted us with a new way of being innovative in the way that we've been talking about? Because I know that you did your research in this period, so it has had some bearing, right?
I would let Tammy to answer that first, because this is where we really see the rural-urban divide.
Go for it, Tammy.
It is a challenge. We have so many rural churches that have limited internet access. Well, even Joel's having trouble today in Calgary, but particularly in congregations that, half your congregation can Zoom in or participate in live stream, and the other half is shut out of that because they either don't have access or not, or it's not good. Or again, with our elderly folk, a lot of them don't even have a computer, never mind internet. So we're having to be, in the rural areas, really creative about how we stay connected with a lot of our people. And sometimes it's the basic telephone conversations. Sometimes it's mailing out a printed worship service. Some can access on the website, but live is challenging at best. and again, access to resources sometimes is limited. And the financial aspect of going high tech. Many congregations were not prepared. So lots have done it or are piecing together and learning on the way. Some, like in communicating with some of the places I visited that were already doing recording worship or live streaming, they've actually taken COVID as an opportunity to build upon and improve what they were doing as well. So it's kind of caused some challenges, but it's also opened up opportunities. Yeah. It's also drawn in young people who have the skills that us old folks don't have.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think you find with risk-taking and innovation that this often arises when a group's back is against the wall. So whether it's the financial declines that we were talking about earlier, or in this case where COVID has actually forced the hand of local churches. And this can be a really healthy and helpful thing to get groups moving on. And in this respect, to build on whatever a weekly liturgy looks like for a community of faith, to say, okay, how do we care for one another, whether it's phone calls, or some churches are sending postcards out whereby members can fill out a postcard that's branded with different things connected to the church, and you mail it out to fellow congregants and neighbors and these kinds of things, to sharing pastoral care among the laity, so that it's not just the paid clergy person who's responsible for caring for one another. So these kinds of things, I think, have been fantastic awakenings, if you will, for local churches that I fully expect will continue on post-pandemic, as well as help churches to think about the weekly gathering as, yes, a very important part for the community in whatever form, but also to reconfigure that it's not the only part of binding the community together. And now churches have experimented with different things in these midweek settings that hopefully will actually strengthen groups post-pandemic in that discipleship culture, that missional culture, that the weekly liturgy is but one and an important part of a much broader conception of mission and discipleship.
Pastor Loraine, any words of wisdom?
So Tammy and I contacted all of the churches we visited in 2019, again last spring, to do a COVID check-in to see whether or not they were still thriving. Exactly. The book's about to come out. They're in the book. Are they thriving anymore? Yikes. Indeed, every church that we visited is continuing in different ways, different challenges. Many of the urban churches were continuing very quickly with their outreach ministries. They immediately focused internally on how to continue worship online. Basically, that was the biggest challenge. Almost all of them immediately moved from one Sunday where the church was open to the next Sunday it was online seamlessly. Like, it was amazing. Every church. Now, a lot of them already had online capabilities, but if they didn't, they moved to them immediately. And if they did, they, as Tammy said, they improved the quality of them. Once they got things going and figured out how to get the worship part going, then I think the next step, I'm not sure the order, order may have changed from church to church, but they worked on how to continue those connections. So lots of them had a lay pastor group start a phone tree. The church I serve, Westworth United, is just finished their 4th round of calls to the 300 families in our church. So that's the one, the caring creatively. Our Sunday school dropped off all sorts of packages of like Frisbee with our church's logo, plants for them to plant either in the churchyard or their yard, flowers, all craft bags, and Sunday school kits where they had linked with biblical lessons and that. So that they did this drop off throughout the summer for kids, because we used to have a vacation Bible school, so that didn't happen. We also so some of the other churches very quickly picked up on their partnerships and their outreach projects, and within a month or two we're back at it, and they dropped the ball for a couple of months trying to get internally organized and get their heads together, but then we're right back out there again. One example in Barrie, the Burton Avenue United Church worked very quickly with the Pride Parade, because they were part of Pride, It didn't happen as a parade, but what they did do was decorate the front yard with all sorts of rainbow themes. And there was like I think it was a planned drive-by, all the places around Barrie that celebrated Pride in a safe way, right? Mm-hmm. That's one example. Another example, this is my personal experience. Last fall, so we've had an annual interfaith dialogue for the last 6 years or so. We canceled it in the spring, but in the fall, we're trying to figure out how to do it. And then the Black Lives Matter came up. A number of us actually were part of some of those outdoor demonstrations. But we thought we should do an interfaith response to racism, all by Zoom. And because it was by Zoom and not organized, usually we have it in different faith communities, and it takes a ton of planning and organizing. Within 2 weeks, because it was on Zoom, we could organize speakers, a 6-week session of speakers from different faith communities on this. Advertise it, and we were able to have people from across Canada and even one from the Philippines connected in. So it gave us a whole nother aha. If we can do these things differently in a way that actually took a lot less time, reached a lot more people. We had to cut off the registration at 225. Like it was, because there were just more and more that came, and we thought anyway the reasons why we had to cut it off, but. And so I think what we're going to do from now on is do a hybrid, once we're able to go back in person, a hybrid way of doing some in person and some online, so that we can connect with global speakers in a way that's affordable and much, much easier to plan. The church right outside, it's Red Deer Lake United Church, you know that right outside of Calgary. It's one of the churches we visited, and they one of the questions they asked fairly early on in the COVID, with the COVID pandemic was, okay, we've changed already. We've accommodated in all sorts of ways with small groups, and most of the ministries continued on in a online kind of way. What of what we've changed do we want to continue? So the question, whilst other churches were still trying to figure out what to do, these churches had already done that. And now we're at the second stage of discernment. And that was, there's some very good things that are happening right now. So what do we want to maintain? How can we do a hybrid model when we get back in person? Right. So that, I mean, those are examples of the mindset that takes crises and turns those into opportunities.
You're right. And the trick is to, as you are keeping the things that you want to keep, to know, to discern what you need to throw out, to make time so that you can, and free the resources so that you can keep it. A lot of churches want to hang on to everything, right?
Yeah, that's
right.
right.
And culture is such that it always drags us back to what we are familiar with.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things about being innovative is to also knowing what to let go and what to keep.
Yeah, that's right. Very much.
So here's a fun question I want to end up with. But I'll preface that by saying, whatever platform I get, I keep saying that my opinion about, if the church is to grow, we have to equip, empower, and mobilize the laity. That's my ongoing mantra, because they constitute 98% of our church. Mm-hmm. But I think that we haven't really paid too much attention to equipping, empowering them. Some churches have, and other churches have just made them consumers.
Yeah.
So I'll preface that. But here's the question. So in my understanding, the early church did not have internet. They did not have buildings. They had people, and they had homes. What advice would you give? Because you mentioned early church at the beginning, Loraine, if you remember, right? Mm-hmm. What advice would three of you give our churches now, given the fact that the early church thrived, they flourished, they grew, they exploded? What's missing? And can we end up with that? That's why it's going to be a fun question, because I'm not sure how people are going to respond to what you say, but I'd like to hear what you got to say. I mean, we talk about urban churches and not having connections. True, but the early church didn't have that either. So what is different? What's missing in the way that we approach congregational vitality and growth and flourishing? And don't all speak at once.
Well, I can say that many books have been written about this by scholars on trying to answer this very question. So it's very complex. It's very nuanced. There are many different variables. It's no single silver bullet solution of, just pray harder, or just do this or that. So, but I would say what has changed is we are in not just a far more secular society in its broadest sense, that is certainly part of it. We're also in Canada as a whole dealing with individuals and a society that is a nation of means. That is, we have economic means. There are marginalized groups, to be sure, but it's quite different than the early church, particularly where we saw signs of growth among the most marginalized groups within society in that context. And so I think some of the groups that are growing, and we always have to be clear and careful about the source of growth in congregations, because most church growth is from transfer growth. Yeah. That is, they leave one church and they join another church, which might be fine for most churches. Yeah. But if your own missional impulse is that one ought to reach those from beyond Christian contexts and circles, for example, then it's a very different kind of conversation. So I think churches that have a particular zeal and understanding for something like evangelism, however understood, and a sense of mission, of partnering with other organizations, I think that's where we're seeing some of the signs of life and vitality. And it's not a function of the mode or modality of doing church, i.e. whether it's a house church or in a building or wherever. I think it grows out of many of the things that we've spoken of in this conversation that really lay the seeds for engaging a wider changing social context that is increasingly so, and I write about this in talking about those who have no religion, those who are raised without any religious context. There isn't a familiarity that even 1 or 2 generations ago existed. And so the starting point is very different. So I could say a lot more. Again, lots of books been written on this, but those would be a few kind of initial thoughts from a sociologist.
Oh, that's really helpful. Yeah, very helpful.
I might add that one of the characteristics of the early church was that they were always attentive to the surrounding needs of their community. So that one of the very, very first descriptions of organizing church leadership took very seriously, how do we attend to the needs of who's going to feed the widows? Who's going to look after that group? That was key to their identity as a church. And they were very clear on what God was calling them to do. So discernment, mission-focused, attending to the marginalized, feeding those who had no money, that was from the beginning essential. That was what continued as you look at church history. I think it was the, I don't have my dates in front of me, but in the, like a couple of centuries later, there was a debate with I think it was maybe it was about 350 or something, somewhere around there, a debate about what to do with these Christians.
Before Constantine.
Actually, it was after Constantine. That's why I said it was
350.
About 350 or so.
Mm-hmm.
It was after Constantine, and it was one of the emperors who returned to his pagan roots. Right. So it was as after Constantine, he was setting up temples and to the pagan gods. And again, a return, trying to reclaim what had been taken by the Christians. And he said, what we need to do, it's a fascinating quote, but I won't have the exact words right, but what we need to do is to make sure that our temple priests are similar to what the Christian priests did. And that was to attend to the needs of those who don't have any money. Like it was that identification of what had made the Christians stand out from the beginning. And let's follow the example of the Christians, he said. It's like, wow, that's a pretty interesting quote. So that is one of the main characteristics that made Christians stand out at the beginning. And if we lose that, I think we lose our identity as Christians, frankly. Christianity was never meant to be an individual religion based on personal salvation. There was no such thing as personal salvation back then. It was communal salvation, this communal sense of faith, of helping one another out. There was not this individual go your own way. That's fine, but it sure isn't Christian. So if we lose that sense of community and that calling as a community to be attentive to the margins and the vulnerable, then I think we lose the passion and the core of what Jesus has taught fairly consistently throughout the.
And I agree. And of course, the that sense of mission comes from a sense of, like you said, calling from God, right?
Yeah.
So I agree that there's no indication of personal salvation, but you are saved to something. You adopt a new way of life, and
exactly.
you follow Jesus as your model, because otherwise we get into this conversation about, I have some very good Buddhist friends who do a much more exceptional job of being generous and compassionate than a lot of Christian believers that I know. Yeah. So we have a story, we have a faith that we hang on to. So I agree with you. Yeah. Tammy, any?
I think I would, from my rural lenses, I think in addition to what Loraine and Joel have said, one of the key components has got to be human relationship. Yeah. And from my perspective here and with other rural congregations, that's one of the pieces of grief that COVID has caused. Yes. Is that sense of isolation and that sense of loss of community. So there's a real piece of work that we need to continue to do. Yes, technology has opened up new doors for us, but it's also created loss for some people. And we have to be really attentive to how we reach, reach those people who have been part of our story and are feeling like they've missed. They're missing or being missed, or they miss others. So there's still that place for finding place. I mean, we live in hope of being able to just shake hands and say hello in ways that we can't right now.
Right.
If I might add one more thing, Tammy, because you reminded me, this COVID epidemic is taking us into very strange territory. And one of those is all of a sudden a struggle between rights and responsibilities. And so we are beginning to hear some churches who are taking the government to court, who are talking about individual rights, the right to worship. And I really do believe that churches that are thriving don't use that language, or are they concerned about what my individual rights are? They are concerned about responsibilities. And that is where the Christian gospel is very, very, very clear. Our responsibilities, that living the way of Jesus, has always been communal care and social welfare. It's never been a question of individual rights. That you won't find that in Scripture. That didn't exist back then. There wasn't such a thing as personal individual rights. They lived communally.
And they cared for the most vulnerable in their midst.
And they cared for the most, absolutely, every time. Yeah. So the really interesting thing is that society is looking to the churches to hear that message, because they're just hearing from this very, very, this fringe minority that's championing individual rights, and they are afraid and disturbed. And now they're interviewing people they never would think of interviewing before, because they're desperate to hear some words of hope from a faith community that will honor social and communal welfare, that compassionate care for one another that Tammy talked about. So this is a really opportune time for churches to, another characteristic of thriving churches is to be a public face of Christ. To be, as Martin Luther said, little Christs in the world, right? 2 nights ago, I received a phone call from CBC. They wanted to interview someone to talk about this. I don't think I would ever have received a phone call from CBC before, right? But there's an opportunity opening up that people are looking to faith communities for help right now. And I think, wow, this is such a gift in that sense, in the midst of lots of suffering.
Well, thank you. As I look across the room, I see bright minds, but I also see some very connected hearts. I know you all did this research not just for information's sake, but you wanted to go to the churches, right? You want to be helpful. So that's all the purpose of what I'm doing now. We have a website, and I'll send you the link very soon. Your books are up on the website, and also from where you can buy them. And at some point of time, I might approach you again to just write something up as well, just contribute to some of the ongoing learning that's happening from your research. Not much research has been done in Canada in this breadth and in this width. So what you have done is really a gift to the Canadian church. And I'm sure there's a lot more to process and debrief, but for now, let's leave it there. Just again, thank you so much. I think one of the blessings of COVID has been that we can do this and people don't complain when they look at a Zoom interview.
I want to thank you, Chris, because what your work is helping get the story out there and sharing.
I don't do the thinking. You do the thinking. Give it to me, and I'll pass it out. I'll be very happy to do that. But I think,
and Joel, I'm looking forward to getting your book and reading it. It's been good to have.
I think the crossover, the intersection is really good, because when I see both, and I mean, you're talking the same thing, just your approach has been slightly different, and that it's good because we need the diversity of approaches as well. So we'll see. I mean, I would love to measure the impact of this and the books in churches actually telling us, here's what we've done. And we are beginning to see some growth in certain areas, and that would be really great. So any last words? Not that they're going to die off very soon, but
just want to thank you all for the conversation. Really believe in good ecumenical dialogue and conversations grounded in empirical data that can inform practice. And so this has been good and enriching for me and for our work at the Institute, and obviously with each of you in your respective areas too. So thank you.
You said that so well, Joel. I'll just stop it there because that's a good rounding up.